I would first of all like to thank Mr. Margulies for being with us today to talk about the photography in his collection. I also am indebted to his incredible staff, including Catherine Hines, his curator, and rest of the staff at the Margulies Warehouse in Wynwood, who made all aspects of this exhibition so effortless. For me, this exhibition was particularly interesting because we focused on the American scene photographs, and it was amazing to see that out of the thousands of works that he had, it was very hard to cull it down to a little under 200 photographs for our current exhibition. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce one of the greatest collectors of the world, Margulies.
Raise your hand, Jeannie. She put together the slides that you will see, as well as my longtime curator and the manager of my collection, Catherine Hines, who puts up with me and suffers. Okay, well, I'm going to go off the track a little bit, and rather than talk just about American photography, I'm going to talk about European photography somewhat, which will mean that these are the European photographers who have influenced what you saw in the show upstairs. And perhaps you will be able to see these works a little better when you understand it. This was one of the first photos I ever bought by Thomas Roof, a German photographer. He was a very hot artist, and when I started collecting photography, I said, well, I don't know what's going on here, so I better get someone that's hot. And so I wound up with a Thomas Roof. I stared at her, she stared back at me, and what you see here is very similar to a passport photo or a driver's license, only it's 6 foot high. And what was important to me was, even though it was a photograph at that time, it fit within the collection. It had a certain presence. And I kept looking at her, and she kept looking at me, and I said, photography works. So this was one of the first pieces I got. Along with Thomas Roof was another photographer, German photographer, named Thomas Struve. And Thomas Struve was also a very, what we would call, objective photographer, whereby he did buildings that were basically nondescript, with no personality, no beauty, no emotion. And that was from the Becher School, who taught photography in Germany at the School of Düsseldorf. And the third one of this group was Andreas Gursky. So they called these three Strusky because they were really very, very popular. These are large photos, and they're called sea prints. And these sea prints were primarily developed in a German laboratory called Regal. So many of the photographers went to Regal for their work to be realized. But those are the three photographers that I started to collect. And when I got these people, I said, well, where did they come from? And why don't I go backward and learn more about it? So I started collecting works that were earlier than this. These were probably 1980s, late 80s, 90s. And I said, they must have been influenced by someone. So I went back to the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus, as you all probably know, was a think tank. It was in Germany again, and it was an experimental type of facility whereby artists would do fabrics, theater sets, architecture. The German government said, you artists should do something which will benefit society as function. So a Mies van der Rohe chair became a Mies van der Rohe chair versus just a chair. They were trying to marry function with art. And eventually the Bauhaus disintegrated. This is a photo montage. It was a lot of experimentation. Photography in the Bauhaus was really not an art form until 1929. And then they decided to teach photography as an art form. The previous years, photography was used to document theater production, take pictures of fabrics done by Annie Albers, and in many cases, we don't even know who the artists were. This is another piece from the Bauhaus. It was all experimental work. This is almost like a radiograph. It's not, but I'm sure that man Ray, with the shadow effect, may have seen this, maybe not. So those were the Bauhaus photos. Meanwhile, at the same time that the Bauhaus was existing, from 1920 to 1930, the same thing was going on in Russia, in a school called Lauderdale. It was run by students. They called it a proletariat school. And again, the government said to these students, do something useful beyond art. The school was started by Rodichenko and his wife, Stepanova. Kandinsky may have had some input into that school. So a lot of these students made these architectural models. And when I saw these photos, I said, these are tremendous photos. With no art, we didn't know who did it. The information on the back of the photos was written in Russian. And this particular work reminds me of the Guggenheim in New York. So I thought that the Russian constructivist movement was very important to my particular collection. So we wound up acquiring quite a few of these. And this is another one of the student models, which was never executed because the Russians did not have the money to execute any of it. Does that look familiar? To me, that looked like a Frank Gehry building. But it was done by a Russian student as a scale model. And there's Bill Ballard by Frank Gehry. I don't know if Frank saw this, but it was done in the early 1900s. So what I deduced from this was the tremendous influence that Russian constructivism had on our present-day architects, as well as Italian futurism. So Budapest ceased to exist in 1930. The government shut them down. Okay, so now we go back to Germany, and we have an artist named August Sander. And when you look at this, it's a posed picture, but somehow those two young people look like objects. They're very, very statuary. They don't show much emotion. And And this is the same area in terms of time by a German photographer named Albert Rengler Potsch. Because these are the photographers, Sander, Potsch, Losfeld, several others, that said, we don't believe in the Bauhaus. We don't believe in experimentation. We're only interested in the object. We're only interested in the photo itself. So this is Rengler Potsch, and so is this. You can see how objective this is. So you look at this stuff, and you might be saying, if you're not familiar with it, big deal. What does it mean? What is it? There's no essence of beauty. There's no essence of interest. And we'll get to that in a little while. This is another German named Hugo Schmaltz. Again, you can see the objectivity of this. It's very serial, very structural, and that's what these Germans did. And this was in the 30s. Why did they use eggs? This is Werner Mons. They used eggs because they cast a shadow. And a lot of these photographers like the idea of showing shadows. So this is a whole bunch of eggs with the shadows. And Mons was all part of that particular vernacular. Okay, here comes the key moment where the Betchers opened the school of Düsseldorf, and they taught Gursky, Struth, and Ruth. The Betchers were doing works that had water towers, glass furnaces, very, very innocuous buildings that probably don't even exist today. And they did them in serials, but they taught at the school. They only did work in black and white. And you could see the sky has no clouds, nothing. It's all gray. It's all nondescript. So the Betchers basically taught Gursky, Struth, and Ruth. And this was called the objectivity of photography. And of course, over the years, Struth, Ruth, Gursky fell in love with different kinds of photography because the financial aspects were too severe to avoid. And Gursky, about a year ago, sold one of his sea prints for $3 million. One American that studied at the school was Miles Coolidge. He studied at the Betcher School. These are trailers which have been converted into living facilities for farm workers. Okay, so now we come into a new theory, and that is a group of artists, group of photographers said, we do not believe in color, we do not believe in emotion, and so they started taking photographs of nothingness. It was like, this is an insurance adjuster coming in and taking a picture. This is like a real estate appraiser. The back of an alley, the back of a warehouse. And one of the great photographers of our time who was involved in this movement was Robert Adams. This is tract housing. And these particular group of artists were called the new topographers. And why they were called the new topographers was because it felt like almost a geological survey or a map. And there was no authorship there. And that's the way they wanted it. These particular topographers really moved to the West Coast, California, and they started taking photos of the New West. What was the Old West? The Old West were the romantic pictures of Edward Weston seeing bikini women on a beach, or the dramatic, high-profile photos of Ansel Adams, the cliffs and the landscape and the magnificent trees, which evoke mist and nostalgia when you looked at it, as if you were saying, gee, I wish I was out in the woods on this cliff, on this mountain, camping. And that was the myth of Ansel Adams, and that was the feeling that they were romantic pictures. And that was the Old West. So the New West came, and that was where Robert Adams comes in. That's where Ed Boucher comes in. They said the New West is not as romantic as what Ansel Adams said, or what Imogen Cunningham said, or what Edward Weston said. It's not that at all. It's about the tract houses. It's about the debris on the roadways. It's about the neon signs. It's about the motels. It's about the diners with the vinyl booths and the plastic ketchup bottles and the sun coming into the window. It was about that. Man invaded the West. So Robert Adams took pictures of landscape coupled with man-made destruction. And he understood that the veterans that came back from the war needed housing. And they couldn't get housing in the cities because it was too expensive. So what did they do? They got housing out in those pristine areas, California and Colorado, which were sleepy places. It looked like those photos were photos that were waiting for something to happen, which never happened. There were very few people in these photos. The photos were like you stop at a traffic light, and there's no one in the car. It was about the human presence without the humans being present. And that's how you look at a photo. You look at a photo, not what the photo is, but what the photo is about. And so you know that it looks like some type of building that people have maybe lived there or gone to church there, and then you have a drive-in movie, but you don't see any evidence of a person. It's like, again, you're waiting for something to happen, and it never does. So these artists were called the topographers. When you mentioned there was no authorship there, that's the way they wanted it. The other artist, Ed Boucher, he was a little different than Adams. You needed to digest Adams. You didn't relate to it right away. It was too conceptual. It was too idea-related. Now, all of a sudden, Boucher gets in a car, convertible, and he starts taking pictures of gas stations. He took 20-some-odd gas stations when he drove the roads, and somehow the buildings don't seem to have any kind of character, but the signs really stand out. This is an old gas station, which definitely doesn't exist. And Boucher took these photos in the 60s, and he said, I'm going to take these photos with a very simple camera, because I don't want art to feel precious. I want it to feel like a snapshot. And that's what he did. He took many of these, and he took swimming pools, and he took very innocuous subjects that you normally wouldn't take. And then he took a parking lot, and then he took 30 photos of parking lots with no cars. In fact, someone said The way this is done, it looks like a Frank Stella black painting, where Frank just did the lines. So he went one step further. He went up on a helicopter and took these photos. And he said, I don't want to take these photos. I'm going to have someone else take them. Isn't that terrific? I'm going to take the artist out of the photo. So he had a photographer take it, and he took the photo and said, this is a found object, just like Duchamp did. I'm sure you're all familiar with Duchamp, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the ready-made and the urinal which he found. So this was the parking lots that Rouchet did. They called him the hipster with a camera. They called him the cool guy in a convertible. So what did he do? More parking lots. No cars, no sign of life. The new topography. He did a series of books. The books had no comments at all. No words. Peter Plagian, the critic, described these books as the books a non-literate book for a non-literate city, being Los Angeles. So many of these books are now considered very much in demand because when he did them, they were just snapshots in a book. And now they become collector's items. The 9 swimming pools. That was one of the few books he did with color. He did another book which was the apartment buildings along one of the streets in Los Angeles. Every one of these photos has something written on them that he did. The smallest boy is Joseph Fortune. The address, his mother said he's 14. He does not look it. This was taken at 6 a.m. in 1909. The group is going into the mill in Dover, New Hampshire. So every single one of these photos has inscriptions on the back. The collection purchased the whole final body of work of the Hine archives, which were about 300 works. And we use them for educational purposes. They're not great photos, but they're historical photos. And schools love this because it's the history of our country. Another well-known photographer from the Farm Security Administration, the government said the farmers are in trouble. They don't have any money. We can't afford to let them drown because if we do, our crops are going to be compromised. So there was the 2 main figures in what they call the FSA, Farm Security Administration, were Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans. This is Dorothea Lange's photo of the migrant mother, a very famous photo. She was driving by this tent and saw this mother. This happened in the 30s. And she saw this mother nursing a child, and she stopped. It was in a place called Napomo, California. And she took many pictures of the migrant mother. You can see the weariness in that mother's face. Because after nursing the child, she probably went out in the fields and worked. Dorothea Lange was a photographer who developed her own pictures. She wouldn't let anybody develop them with her. And she lived in California. Another photographer of that FSA was Ben Shum. And this particular photo shows workers working in the fields. were 4 or 5 well-known photographers from the FSA. This is one of them, whose name is Russell Lee. There's another named Arthur Rothstein. What a very appealing picture in the sense of describing the plight of these people. This is the Fields family by the world-famous, well-known Walker Evans. Evans was probably the model photographer that people today, the young people today, are most influenced by. He didn't take pictures with people in them. Primarily, they were, again, people who had been there. For example, the empty streets. He said, I will take pictures of the jury, but I don't want to take pictures of the judge. He was considered the connoisseur of the commonplace. Abandoned cars. He once said, I want to take a picture of the man who has no car versus the man who has 3 cars. So he took photos of very mundane subjects, and somehow he gave it a certain dignity, and they became very, very well accepted. Not right away. They were rejected by many magazines, and then he worked for a magazine for a long time, and he really liked writing and photos. But Walker Evans is like the photographer that influences today's subjective young photographers. When Walker Evans reached a certain age, he could no longer put the tripod. He could no longer go around and take pictures. He became very difficult for him to walk and get around. And the nomenclature he used was too cumbersome for him. So he started taking Polaroids. This is a Polaroid. And when you look at this, somehow, for me, there's a sense of graffiti there. There's a sense of reality, advertising. Who knows? Maybe Andy Warhol saw this. There's another one of his Polaroids. He did 1,300 Polaroids in his lifetime. Prior to this, he made a comment that, quote, color is vulgar. He didn't want to take color photos, but he did when time came to him where he couldn't do what he wanted to do anymore. Another one of Walker's Polaroids. One of his disciples, and the woman that really idolized him, was a street photographer named Helen Levitt. Helen Levitt was a New York City resident who never traveled anywhere. Once in a while, she went to Mexico, took photos there. Her body of work is graffiti, the streets of New York, and the streets of Mexico. She didn't want to live anywhere else. She lived in a 4-story walk-up. And when she was in her 80s and 90s, she walked up with the groceries and everything else. And this is a graffiti work. The collection has a pretty big body of work, and we lend out the Levitts to various institutions. These are all what they call vintage works, that they are not printed later. They're the actual early works that Helen Levitt did. And I said she loved the streets of New York. Again, another graffiti piece. This was a subway picture. This picture was done by Walker Evans. He went into the subway and he put the camera in his coat so no one could see him. And when the time came when he thought he could see a subject that he wanted to take, he took his coat and opened it, snapped the camera. He took a series of subway photos. They're very difficult to come by. If you see that little ring on the bottom, that's a subway photo by Helen Levitt. The ring is that she used a smaller camera to take these photos, and obviously was inspired by Walker Evans. I just had to throw this in because of the subway. This is a sculpture we have of George Siegel. This is a real subway that was in the yard of, they were upgrading the subway system in New York. And George told me that he went to get this subway and he wanted to do a sculpture of this. And when he went to the subway, to the stockyards, the man said, "We don't sell New York City property." And George said, "Well, what are you going to use it for?" He said, "It doesn't matter. We don't sell New York City property, and you can't buy it. But if you come here after 6 o'clock tonight, we can do something." So George told me he gave me $15, and he said, "What are you going to use it for?" He said, "I'm a sculptor. I live in New Jersey. I live on a chicken farm that I converted to a studio." Another non-photographer depicting black life in New Orleans, the name Ralston Crawford, who was a precisionist painter of American painting. Isn't that a fantastic photo? And he did several of them, and we were able to acquire some for our collection. That's the thrill of collecting photography or anything else, is when you get the work, it becomes so much a part of what you're doing. Okay, there was another photographer who became very well known named William Eggleston. He was considered the American color photographer because he dealt with a method of developing which was called dye transfer, so he could manipulate the color. This is a black and white work by William Eggleston outside of the Zayre department store before he started getting into color. This is another Eggleston, Barn Clothes. I'm sure many of you folks remember that. The color in this photo is not that good, but this is when he was doing his color photos. Color photos by Eggleston is a collector in Los Angeles in the movie business. And he buys every new Eggleston that comes out. So far, the highest price that I saw in an Eggleston was $400,000 for a picture of a car. He is the father of color photography in America. One of his idols, or the man who idolizes him, is a rural photographer who lives in Washington named William Christianberry. And he takes these rural subjects of farms in the southern part of the country. But look at the feeling of these houses that are in very bad repair, and yet they have a certain link to things. This is another Christian barrier. One of the great color photographers, along with Bill Eggleston, is an artist named Stephen Shaw, who is strictly a colorist. Stephen teaches at Bard College. He's a professor there. And he was the youngest photographer to ever sell a color work by an American to the Museum of Modern Art. The head curator of photography, named John Zarkowski, loved his work. And they bought Stephen's work when he was 14 years old, and then eventually gave him a show when he was 23. The early works of Shaw were focused on the dinners he had as he traveled around all the states. He went all over the country taking pictures of diners, small camera, and little charming rural stores. This was where Stephen started his work. When he finally got a bigger camera, he then started taking pictures of a panoramic sense, where he would get the street scenes, but he still retained that small town feeling of the cars. You can tell by the cars that it's a very rural community. He's one of our great color photographers. This is the latest acquisition I made of Stephen's work, and it's a photo in Israel. He went to Israel, and he took this photo, and I responded to it. So, boy. Okay, in the younger generation of primarily color is an artist named Alex Saab. He is the Walker Evans of 2010. This is a young photographer, magnum photographer, tremendous empathy toward people and the subject. He's from Minnesota, and I think he's just a fantastic photographer, and he's getting a lot of recognition now. So I took a position on Alex's work, and I'm very happy I did, because I think the guy is a terrific artist. This is another Alex Saab. He captures people in such a way that you can sense the drama. There's a local artist, I don't want to refer to him as a local artist, but I did a project probably 10 years ago, 11 years ago, in a very poor section in Miami called Overtown. And this photographer taught photography at FIU. Her name is Peggy Nolan. And these are the slums of Overtown. At the time, I was involved in getting a youth center built for after-school kids. And we wanted to take visual works that would develop some emotion for possible contributors. So this is a typical street in Overtown that she took, and she brought her students all over Overtown, which is a heavy crime area. And she just went there and took these pictures with her students. And this is another one. And we eventually built this youth center, which was basketball court, computer center, classrooms, and she and her students, they did all the photography, and it was really terrific what they did. Another young photographer who I appreciate his work is a fellow named Jeff Browse. This is a photo from New Orleans after the tremendous flooding. Jeff works in Syria. He's probably in his 40s. He travels the country. He did a very nice series of housing, very modest housing, tract housing of Filipino farm workers that all lived in one area in California. This is, of course, as I said, the New Orleans destruction. Again, another photo of New Orleans. So he went there, and he stayed there, and he took all these pictures. Now, this looks like the Betchers from the School of Düsseldorf. But it's not. It's Jeff Browse. This is a series of pole equipment over railroad cars. So when the cars come under that, the coal is released. And many of these are not even functional. It's real antiquated. And he went and took that whole series, and I found that to be very dramatic. Coney Island, Marvin Newman, boarded up, closed. People walking around on a bright day. Another Coney Island photo by Marvin Newman. They don't need any description. They're self-descriptive. This is a man that photo was taken by Taryn Simon. And this man was unjustly put in jail. And DNA showed, trying to find a piece of paper which tells you about it. I got it, I think. Yeah. It's about a man who was unjustly put in jail. And Taryn Simon is a photographer. And this is the scene of the crime that allegedly he did. I'm going to read you the description of the photo. Ronald Jones, south side of Chicago, Illinois, served 8 years of a death sentence for rape and murder in 2002. The way he got out of that was Taryn Simon got a fellow named Barry Scheck. I'm sure you've heard of him. He's an attorney who's an expert in DNA. And he was able to get this man out of jail. This is another case of Larry Youngblood at the alibi location where they arrested him in Tucson, Arizona, with Alice Lehner, Youngblood's girlfriend, and his alibi witness at the trial. He served 8 years of a 10.5-year sentence for kidnapping, sexual assault, and child molestation. One of the most illustrious photographers of our time is Cindy Sherman. When she was a student, she decided to characterize herself in different costumes. She went to a thrift shop and she bought all these costumes, and this is called the bus riders, as if she's waiting for a bus. This is all her. She sometimes impersonated a man. sometimes a black person. And she just sat there waiting for the bus. But this was all Cindy Sherman before she did her very well-known film stills. The film stills put her on the map. She did 70 some odd of them, 79. Museum of Modern Art bought them years ago for $1 million. And after that, Cindy was a household name. This is the first series she did, The Bus Riders. Okay. One of the reasons she did this was waiting for a bus. A woman sometimes has fear because she's all alone. There's no one around her, and she might feel a little threatened. This was at the same time, if you recall, when the serial killer, son of Sam, was loose in New York and going to cars and shooting people. And the police couldn't get him. They couldn't find him until they finally got him as a clue. He got a traffic ticket near an area where he had killed someone. And they found him and tried tracing him down. But Son of Sam was an influence. And you always looked at these women sitting, even in the film stills, as a tremendous vulnerability. A woman alone. There might have been a shadow. You don't know what's going to happen. That's Cindy again. Cindy. There's a category called constructed photography, whereby the artist builds, he essentially is a sculptor, and he builds a scenario. This looks like it came out of Toys R Us. But this is John Casavia building a kitchen, and then he takes a picture of it. After he builds it, he throws it away. This is Casavia again. This is an American photographer. And these are hospital beds that are not real. He builds them, and he puts mist around it, so it looks real. This is another artist named Jeff Wall. Jeff Wall does these large cinematography scenarios. This is called, what's it called, Catherine?
Man with Rifle.
Yeah, probably so. There was a sniper, basically, without a gun, and it's a California scene. It's a big lighthouse. And the production used in Jeff Wall's work is just like you make a feature film somewhere. Gee, next time I'll call you, I promise. Another constructed scenario is Gregory Crewdson. He teaches at Yale, and he stages these scenes with the lighting and the traffic lights and people crossing the street. Gregory Crewdson. He taught many of these photographers that graduated from Yale, especially the 5 women who are known as the Yale 5. This is one of the Yale 5 named Justine Curley. And she went out to 45 different locations in a van with a 1-year-old child and took a lot of these photos of people who are bathing in the natural environment. She's one of my favorites. I really like her work. This is Justine again, of students posing on a raft, a makeshift raft, pulling it. And finally, this is an artist named Barbara Probst, Probst, lives in the United States. This is Grand Central Station. This is one photograph. And what Barbara does, she takes 6 cameras with different kinds of lenses and a remote control. And the picture is snapped with the press of a button, all 6 cameras. So this woman in the coat is that woman in the coat below it, and that woman, it's one and the same on different angles. It's about time and space. The time being, she takes the picture in a second, but it's all about the setup on space and moving the camera to a place where she depicts how this is going to look. This is another one of Barbara's work of someone on a rooftop. Again, it's one of the same. It's one photo taken by that synchronized button with 4 different cameras. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. I need Bonnie to help because I'm hard hearing, and if I don't know the answer, I'm really hard.
My question is, this is about collecting, and what gave you the incentive to start collecting photography?
I heard that. The incentive was, I had reached a point in my collecting where I had a lot of paintings and sculpture, and it was getting so expensive that I just couldn't sustain the type of work that I had in my collection. So I said, going back to that Thomas Roof staring at me, said, you know, this is a new way of learning. This is an area that I can put in a warehouse and have children come in and teach things, and that's what gave me the incentive. So we have a child's program that kids come in and we give them tours, adults come in, we give them tours, and it's been a very nice activity for us.
Okay, second question, Jerry.
Hi, Marty.
Hi, Jerry.
I have just a couple of questions. How much fade do you get in photography?
How much what?
Fade. I mean, you get fading in some of these older pictures?
The sea prints are very, very fragile,
Yeah.
and they might fade. But generally speaking, we store them in darkness. The black and whites are usually no problem. We do have trouble with some, but we try and sell them to people like you if we have a problem.
And the other question I had was, are these editions at all? Are these just one of a kind?
Yes, most photographs are editions. They can be editions and still be vintage. So the photographer may authorize 10 photos, but he may do it during a certain period of time, which means they are vintage. If you do it beyond a certain period of time, which is not really defined, it becomes what's known as a modern print. For me, it doesn't matter if it's vintage or modern. I'm an image collector. The image is most important to me. I don't really care about the value of the work.
Thank you.
Maybe one more question? She's interested in setting one doing interested in the cell phone photographs.
If you read the New York Times today, you'll see an article on Ray Johnson, who used to send mail to his friends. I don't know if you saw that, but he's a mail artist, and he would do sketches and send mail out to his friends. Eventually, he took his life by jumping in the water in Long Island and swimming out to the ocean, disappearing. But all his work was considered mail art. Relating to your question, for me, it's not about the methodology of something. If the work appeals to my sensibility, That's all that's important to me. I don't care how it's done or who did it. It's a matter of an image. It's what's called felt content, what you feel toward an object, not what other people say or what reviewers write. It's about that which fits into the collection. So if something from a cell phone is good, okay. Thank you all very much.